Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I see people still signing on, but I think since we're at our time, we'll get started. Thank you so much for joining us for the first in our Stream Compensatory Mitigation Webinar Series. We're really happy you could all be here for this kickoff webinar. My name is Rebecca Kistlinger. I'm a Science and Policy Analyst at the Environmental Law Institute, and I direct our Wetlands program. This webinar series on stream compensatory mitigation is hosted by the Environmental Law Institute and was developed in coordination with an advisory committee of stream mitigation experts. The series is funded by an EPA Wetland Program Development Grant, and we thank them so much for their support, both financially and also substantively as we develop this webinar series. For those of you who aren't familiar with ELI, I'll just give a brief description of our wetlands program. ELI is a nonprofit law and policy research organization. We're based in Washington, D.C. We've been around for about 50 years, and our wetlands program has been around for several decades as well, almost 40 years. We provide timely, balanced information on wetland law, policy, and science and management through research, education, and convening, such as this webinar series. There's a lot more information on the work that we do on our website. The URL is here on the screen. You can also join our new mailing list called Wetlands and Waters from that screen, and we hope you will check that out. So we have a great lineup for this plan for this webinar series. We're kicking off today with the status of stream compensatory mitigation, and we have another webinar ready to go August 27th on assessing stream functions and conditions, challenges and solutions. It's a great webinar. We're really looking forward to that. And I'll be sending out the invite for that webinar in about a week or so. So stay tuned. If you're on this webinar, you'll get that invite. We'll be announcing the remaining webinars. We'll get to 10 webinars over the next few months. So we have lots of great things in the works, and we're looking forward to that. So stay tuned for more invites to come over the next few months. You can find the presentations and recordings of the webinars on our website. We'll have an event page for each of the webinars. The event page for this one is where you found the registration link. We have posted the presentations for this webinar, and we will also post the archive recording of the webinar on this page, and we'll eventually have a series page where all these are linked. We also have additional information on our stream compensatory mitigation work on our wetlands page. The URL is here. You can navigate to that through our wetlands page as well. Or feel free to email me at any time for more information on any of the work that we're doing or this webinar series. My email address is there on the screen. So today, we're kicking off the series with the status of stream compensatory mitigation. We have a really great lineup of speakers. I'm going to kick it off with a review of our 2016 report on stream compensatory mitigation policy and practice. And then I'm going to turn it over to our esteemed panel of experts on stream mitigation and restoration to talk about their perspectives on the status of stream compensatory mitigation. We're going to start out with Steve Martin, an environmental scientist from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Institute for Water Resources. Much of Steve's work focuses on compensatory mitigation policy. He's the national technical lead for Ribbits. He also teaches aspects of compensatory mitigation policy to Corps staff and other federal and state agencies, and provides technical and policy assistance to Corps districts and headquarters. He's been involved in the development of tools to assist regulators in improving compensatory mitigation. Prior to joining IWR, he worked as senior scientist at Norfolk District Regulatory Branch, as well, and working on a number of projects there. So thanks, Steve, for joining us. Then Brian Topping, an environmental protection specialist from US EPA, will follow Steve with his perspective on the status of stream compensatory mitigation. Brian's been at EPA since 2004, working primarily in Clean Water Act Section 404 regulatory program. Before that, he was also at EPA Region 4 in Atlanta and the Portland District of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He's currently working on program tracking and reporting, as well as stream assessment and compensatory mitigation issues, among others. Then we have a couple of speakers from the Association of State Wetland Managers. First, Brenda Zolich, policy analyst at ASWM, will be speaking. Brenda conducts research and policy analysis on wetland and stream issues. Recently, Brenda's completed a national status and trends state summaries project analyzing the 50 state wetland programs across the US, as well as a national stream identification, delineation, and mitigation study, and a communications case study project, and a wetland training needs assessment and enhancement project. She's currently leading projects focused on increasing access to high quality wetland training and improving energy permitting to protect wetlands. And then finally, Jean Christie from ASWM, the executive director of ASWM, will be speaking and concluding our panel. Jean is currently the executive director, where she's been since 2001 of ASWM. Before that, she was at USDA Natural Resources Conservation System Service, as well as US EPA Wetlands Division. And with that, I just have a few items of logistics before we get started with the rest of the webinar today. All of the participants are on mute right now, but we really do encourage you to participate today, and we hope that you will ask lots of questions. And you can do that by typing in your questions in the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, or by raising your hand, and then I can check out to see, to unmute you and you can ask your question. So I'd love for you to all practice that right now. And tell us how many people are in your office listening to the webinar. Are you alone? And let us know where you're listening in from, and that gives us a good opportunity to see who's out there and give you a chance to practice a little bit typing in those messages, so that we get a lot of participation when it comes to the question period. Excellent. Some of those are coming in now. Great. Thanks a lot for doing that. If you have any technical questions during the webinar, that you can email me, and I will do my very best to help you out with those technical questions as we go along. And the URL again to download the presentations is on the screen. We will stop after each presentation to offer you the opportunity to ask a few questions of each speaker, and then we'll have more time at the end of all of the presentations for more questions. So with that, I'm going to switch over to my presentation and get started. Get us started on the webinar. All right. Okay. So as I mentioned, I'm going to kick off today's webinar with a review of the findings from our 2016 study on stream mitigation policy and practice. So that project was done in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy and Stream Mechanics, Will Harmon from Stream Mechanics. And with the overall project, we wanted to assess really the current state of stream compensatory mitigation guidance or standard procedures, compensatory mitigation practice, and the science. So the outputs of that study included 4 white papers, one summarizing our assessment of stream mitigation policy, one summarizing an assessment of stream mitigation practice, a white paper summarizing an assessment of stream mitigation, stream mitigation science that was done by Will Harmon at Stream Mechanics based on a literature review, and then a white paper summarizing an analysis of stream mitigation policy and practice and gaps and areas for improvement that was done by the Nature Conservancy. We rolled all those white papers up into a report that includes an overview and some additional analysis, and that can be found on our webpage. So today I'm going to just focus on the 2 pieces, the policy and practice pieces that ELI undertook for that report. And our goals for our piece of the work really were to, pardon me, undertake an in-depth inventory of current stream mitigation guidance and procedures at the core district as well as the state level to the best of our ability, and then to characterize current state of mitigation practice across the country based on a series of interviews. So just really briefly reviewing our methodology included both document review as well as interviews. So in terms of document review, we looked at 32 stream mitigation related standard operating procedures, guidelines, and other documents that were developed by states as well as Corps districts and one Corps division. And we really weren't necessarily intending to be completely comprehensive, although we think we did gather most of what was out there at the time, which was about completed at about the end of 2015. We were able to obtain most of the documents from Corps district websites or from Ribbits. Some of the documents we obtained directly from Corps or state agency personnel. We didn't find guidance documents for all 38 Corps districts. I'll show you a map on the next slide of what we did cover. Some of the policies are documents applied to an entire district. Some were covered a particular state. The documents varied in the level of scope and detail. So some were more programmatic documents. Others were things like checklists and guidance letters. And then sometimes districts or states had sort of a collection of documents that included assessment methodologies or site selection guidelines or mitigation bank instrument templates. So we tried to gather as many of those as we could for our review. Some of the policies, about 11 of the standard operating procedures, were developed prior to the regulations in 2008, but were still in use at the time of our review. But the bulk of them were either newly created or substantially revised after the 2008 regulations. So here, this is just the map of the areas that we covered in the review of the areas that were covered by the documents we reviewed. And then quickly, our methodology for our interviews. We conducted telephone interviews based on a standard template. We interviewed staff from 12 Army Corps districts representing a range of regions and ecological systems and regulatory settings. And those districts were selected in collaboration with Corps headquarters. We also spoke with representatives from 3 federal agencies, NOAA, Fish and Wildlife Service, and EPA, as well as 5 state agencies, and also individuals from the private sector who practice or consult on stream mitigation, and as well as NGOs. We covered a real range of topics in the interviews because we wanted to get a good sense from this group of people about, their experience and expertise on stream compensatory mitigation practice. So we asked about extent and evolution of stream compensatory mitigation in their jurisdiction, major sources of impact, are they using guidelines or standard operating procedures? And then we went into more detail on certain aspects of practice. So for example, what stream compensatory mitigation approaches and techniques were used, how debits or credits are determined, are there any assessment methodologies in practice, how service areas are selected, and then information on performance standards, monitoring requirements, and adaptive management. And then we finally asked about any gaps or challenges in current practice so that we could sort of highlight those at the end of our report as areas for future study. So we summarized the results of all that, the document review and interviews in these categories. I don't have a lot of time today. All of the details are in the report, but I'm going to really quickly breeze through our results on these, so you get sort of a flavor of what we found, and we have lots of examples in the reports. So in terms of site selection, ultimately what we found in most districts, approval of stream compensatory mitigation sites was taking place generally on a case-by-case basis, although nearly all, in practice, nearly all the compensation takes place within the same watershed as impacts. Most of the districts' guidance documents define watersheds as an 8-digit HUC, although there was a range from 6-digit to 12-digit HUCs. There were a few SOPs that specifically mentioned ecoregions as geographical boundaries, although those were often secondary requirements, using HUCs first and then ecoregions second. We heard and read that regulators consider a variety of criteria when evaluating site selection, including site gradient, site viability, distance from impact site, preservation of unusual flora and fauna, etc. And also that site selection is driven by some other factors sometimes, such as economics, and is still often opportunistic. You know, often a site is selected because it's available, not necessarily because it's, you know, the watershed plan has identified it as the best site. Those sites might not always be available for compensation projects. In terms of service areas, few of the documents we reviewed had extensive guidance. Most use 8-digit HUCs at least as a starting point for service areas. In terms of the watershed approach, we found few details on the watershed approach in any of the documents that we reviewed. There wasn't any extensive guidance that we found for how the watershed approach should be carried out. A lot of SOPs listed some general criteria for site selection that included taking the watershed into account. Some of the SOPs had a bit more specific guidance. For example, the state-specific SOP from Maryland talked about that the mitigation plan should describe how the proposed mitigation is consistent with goals and recommendations in the watershed. There were also a few SOPs that granted additional credit for mitigation, for example, in designated priority watersheds. And the Wyoming SOP also substantially increased credit calculation if the applicants used a watershed approach and then defined what that meant within the SOP. Most folks that we talked to identified a lack of watershed plans as a significant impediment to implementing the watershed approach. Okay, so debits. We identified several approaches to debit determination. Many of the SOPs provided tables that allow district staff to determine debits. And those generally listed a number of impact factors such as stream type or priority area or existing condition or duration of impact, cumulative impacts, for example, and then assigned a range of multipliers to those impact factors in order to come up with the debit. So for example, this is the table from Missouri listing the adverse impact factors on the left, stream type, priority area, et cetera, impact activity, and then the range of multipliers based on the categories within each of those adverse impacts. The multipliers were then added together and then multiplied by the linear feet of the reach to calculate debits. In the report, we have a table that summarizes all this information from all of the debit determination tables that we found within the SOPs or other documents. So you can sort of see how each of these different districts or states are setting up these tables and sort of compare across them. Some of the other ways that the SOPs are using to calculate debits were more straightforward ratio calculators where the debit was determined by multiplying linear feet by a set multiplier, for example. And then there were a few that we found that are incorporating assessment methodologies into debit determinations. For example, the South Pacific Division Mitigation Ratio Checklist, Pennsylvania, West Virginia example, and we go through in more detail those different debit calculators. There were also some SOPs that are including cumulative impacts in their debit determinations. And in terms of credit determination, many of the districts use interactive worksheets that operate in much the same way as the debit tables. There's a range of factors that are included, each with different multipliers that are used to calculate credits for a given project. There are several districts that are linking functional lift to credit generation or incorporating assessment methodologies in the determination of credits as well, and those are listed here. Many of the documents that we reviewed and folks that we talked to talked about buffer credits. Many districts or states, SOPs authorize credits for restoration, enhancement, or preservation of buffers. Sometimes they do that within a given credit determination table or there's a separate buffer table. In general, the credits were based on buffer size. A lot of times they were given minimum or maximum widths. And then sometimes credits were based on the activities, so be it restoration, enhancement, or preservation. There, may affect the number of credits that are given for a buffer. And these tables are in the report, so I know I'm going through this really quickly, so you should be able to find them in there. There were only a few documents that we could find that included credit release schedules or even example credit release schedules. A lot of documents referred to credit release schedules but didn't establish one. Instead, they may talk about the importance of establishing a credit release schedule that is tied more specifically to a given project. Where we did find examples or specified credit release schedules, there are a lot of similarities, as you can see in this table, among the different districts or divisions that are including information on a credit release schedule. So performance standards, most SOPs didn't mention performance standards at all. Some included some general language about performance standards that generally tracked what the rule says about performance standards and how they should be developed. There were a handful of SOPs, though, that did provide more detailed information. Most of them included, they often included physical criteria and riparian buffer criteria for performance standards. Chemical and biological criteria were much less commonly talked about in the documents that we reviewed. And the practice with the folks we talked to, what we heard was most of the IRTs are creating performance standards that are based on channel dimension, pattern, profile, and bed material. And we have also a table in the report that sort of details some of the example performance standards that were included in the documents from across the country. So in terms of monitoring requirements, they range from 3 to 5 years or longer. Most were 5 years as a minimum, although several districts required as many as 10 years for certain projects. Some SOPs included some more specific requirements on what should be monitored. Most of those outlined some specific monitoring criteria, included physical monitoring. Some also included some information on biological monitoring. Examples of what must be monitored from some of the documents included hydrology, vegetation, soils, geomorphology, nutrients. Some required photos, like riffle photos, others bar samples or stream channel stability, etc. So there was a range in some of the details that were included in the documents. And there were several standard operating procedures that provided required that specific performance standards were expressly tied to monitoring requirements. So I'll finish up with some information from the documents on long-term management issues. In terms of land protection, many of the documents indicated a preference for easements or direct land transfer as land protection mechanisms over things like deed restrictions. Some of the documents had provisions related to long-term management, although most of that tracked with what's included in the rules, so that a long-term management plan must identify who's going to be responsible for long-term management and list any long-term management needs as well as where the funding would come from. Most of the SOPs did recognize an importance of adaptive management, either by requiring that the mitigation plan includes some minimum language on adaptive management and how that will be carried out if necessary, or that they required adaptive management if and when a project encounters difficulty. So I know I sort of raced through all that, and it's a lot of information. Like I said, there's a lot of detail in our reports. They can be found on our website. I'm happy to send you a PDF of the report or provide you with any additional information, but please take a look. And I'm happy to take a few questions now. I know that was a little bit longer, and we're going to get on to Steve, but I have a few questions coming in, and if there are more in-depth questions, please type those in. Okay. I did have one question about how in lieu fee programs are calculating credits for perennial versus intermittent water courses. I don't have the answer to that, but I'm going to throw it out there in case someone else on the phone does. It'd be something that would be interesting to look at. And then one other question about slides. The slides are available on the website, and I will post that URL on the GoToWebinar control panel as soon as we get over to Steve. Any other questions? All right, well then I'm going to hand it over to Steve. Steve, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Gotcha.
Okay. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I'm going to provide a brief characterization of third-party stream mitigation utilizing data from rivets. And when I say third-party stream mitigation, I'm talking mitigation banks and in lieu fee programs. Basically, enterprises that assume the mitigation liability of a permittee. Before I do that, it's worth looking at the overall market associated with stream compensation. This first slide is not from rivets, but it's from an analysis of FORM. That's the Corps' permit tracking system data, and it was conducted by Catherine Burney. Catherine is the managing director of Ecosystem Investment Partners. It's a national mitigation banking firm. And what this slide shows, it provides a sense of the overall market, at least as of 2015. And it shows the share of stream mitigation, stream impacts that different forms of mitigation are providing. So at the bottom in orange is mitigation banks. Above that are in lieu fees, and then various forms of permittee responsible mitigation, on-site and off-site. And what it's depicting is that at least over that 6-year period of time, there was an increase in the relative share of compensation being provided by mitigation banks and by in lieu fee programs, and a decline in the relative share of compensation being provided by permittee responsible mitigation. We can look at it further, and the remainder of the slides are basically based entirely on data from rivets. This plot shows the approval of banks that have wetland credits and banks with stream credits through 2017. So this is current. I basically ran the analysis through the end of December 2017, and we can see that stream mitigation banking really didn't start to grow until about 2001, 2002, and this likely corresponds to changes in core regulations and policies acknowledging stream compensation. So the nationwide permit regs and regulatory guidance letter 02-2. The curve for stream banks picks up again slightly around 2008, corresponding with issuance of the mitigation rule. Now, what this plot is actually showing, again, data from rivets, and I'm plotting bank approvals over time, identifying separately banks that have wetland credits and banks with stream credits. You need to realize there's an overlap here because in many cases you have mitigation banks that are providing both wetland and stream credits. So to get a total number of bank approvals, you wouldn't add the number of banks with wetland credits approved in a year to the number of banks with stream credits. The important thing to show here is that the numbers of banks that are providing stream compensation has increased markedly since, say, 2000, and substantially since issuance of the mitigation rule in 2008. Here's basically an image showing the locations of operational bank and in lieu fee projects providing stream compensation in the lower 48. You've actually got two different icons here. You may not be able to pick them out. Actually three. You've got inverted teardrops, which are bank sites. There are squares, which would be in lieu fee project sites. And occasionally you'll see little umbrellas that represent sites associated with umbrella mitigation banks. It's important to note that the sites are concentrated in the East, the Midwest, the South, and to some extent on the West Coast. There is no third-party stream mitigation project sites in 16 states. This is a depiction of bank and in lieu fee program stream credit service areas. Again, this is as of the end of last year. The tan polygons are in lieu fee program service areas. The blue polygons are bank service areas. You can see in many states there's considerable overlap. For instance, in Missouri, in Montana, West Virginia, Virginia, North Carolina, and so on. But there are 16 states that are completely unserved by one or the other form of compensation, and many states, 22 of them, that are only partially served by one or the other, such as Oregon, Colorado, Iowa, South Dakota, and so on, Texas. This plot is a plot of mitigation type or mitigation activities that are potentially generating mitigation credits. It's actually considering stream length, so it's not considering the amount of credits generated by these different practices, but the amount of stream length that was preserved or reestablished or rehabilitated to generate credits. So we're not talking the relative amounts of credit, but the relative compensation, the relative amount of stream that is being incorporated into compensation. And what's important to consider here, that restoration, that is reestablishment of streams or rehabilitation of streams, is responsible for nearly 50% of the stream compensatory mitigation provided either by banks or in lieu fee programs across the country. Preservation is making up a substantial percentage at 18%. It's important to note that there's nearly 20% for which the type of mitigation activity was not specified in the initiation transactions for rivets. Your guess is as good as mine as to how that might be allocated across the sites. One very important point to notice is that establishment as a form of compensatory mitigation is making up a very small percentage of compensatory mitigation. The actual number is 0.4%. And this is consistent with the mitigation rule, which is basically saying you can't create streams. They're difficult to establish or replace resources. You can reestablish, you can rehabilitate them or enhance them, but you can't create them. For my last slide, I wanted to give you a sense of the amount of stream compensation activity through banks and in lieu fee programs since 2008. Basically, what this plot is showing you is that there's been about a six-fold increase in stream compensation provided by mitigation banks or in lieu fee programs since issuance of the mitigation rule in 2008. Now, this particular plot is a plot of transactions. It's not an attempt to convert into linear feet. It's actually counting numbers of transactions. And this is important in part because, as Rebecca indicated earlier, there are many different ways of assessing credits and assessing impacts. One relatively unbiased way to look at it would be in terms of numbers of credit transactions. Another important point here, that by 2017, mitigation banking provided 79%, nearly 80% of the stream credit transactions, the withdrawals of credits from banks or in lieu fee programs combined. In lieu fee program credits made up the remaining 21%. 13% of those were advanced credits, credits associated with a program service area, not a site. And the remainder, 8%, were released credits. that's all I wanted to present today.
Thanks, Steve. That's a great overview. I should have mentioned before you started that you have to take off after your presentation. So please, if you have questions for Steve, now's the time to type those in. There was one clarification. I know, Steve, that I can't remember, you cut it off, your Ribbits analysis off at the end of 2017. Is that right?
Yes.
So,
and the rationale behind that is the fact that as much as we would want for the data to be real time, my experience is that there's often a lag in some districts in entering data, and that often depends upon how data is entered into Ribbits in a given district. Some districts have given bankers permissions, and in general, that data is much more current than in many districts that enter the data themselves.
Right, yeah, that makes sense. And also, you know, for folks out there who have new programs, those weren't necessarily reflected in your map, like the Indiana program.
That's correct.
And here's another question. Has there been an analysis to determine if the number of banks and LUFI programs, et cetera, are meeting, this is a good one, are meeting the Corps' mission to have no net loss of stream and wetland habitat?
I don't know of any study of that nature. That would certainly be something interesting to look at. One of the challenges in doing something of that nature would be to come to an agreement or an understanding, a definition as to what constitutes no net loss of function or area. In other words, how are you going to measure it? And as far as stream compensation, I'm not aware of any analysis so far that has looked at anything other than administrative compliance. Great question, though.
Right, yeah, good question, and maybe Brian will touch on it as well, and the work that EPA is doing on looking at evaluation of compensation sites. So I don't know if you want to touch on that a little bit, Brian, in your presentation, but that is a good question. Can you clarify the difference between rehabilitation versus enhancement activities?
Okay, so in enhancement, you're basically elevating one function, and simply looking at one function. It might be, for instance, control of invasives. It might be placement of in-stream habitat. With rehabilitation, you're taking a degraded stream channel and you're typically restoring a suite of functions to that channel. So you may be reconnecting it to its floodplain. You may be reestablishing riparian habitat. You may be restoring a number of functions, including in-stream habitat. So generally, rehabilitation is a more comprehensive effort than enhancement often would be.
Great, thank you. And one last question before we move on. The question is, since in-LUFI transactions are often 2 to 10 times larger than bank transactions, does that affect the chart, and are you looking at apples and oranges? And maybe your thoughts first on whether you think the in-LUFI transactions are that much larger than bank transactions, and then how you might be able to look at it in a chart. And I know you explained that this is a stream credit transaction, but
right. So this is a count of actual transactions, not the size of compensation, and it's an interesting topic to look at. It would certainly be something worth looking at further. Just observationally, I've not noticed marked differences in stream credit size between bank and in-LUFI programs in their transactions. That's certainly worth looking at, and you could certainly get to it using the interactive reporting tools in Ribbits. It's a really great suggestion, and I think I'm going to steal it for next year's Mitigation Banking Conference. It's a great idea and something that I never looked at before.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Steve, for taking the time today. We know you have to jump off, but we really appreciate that. It was a great overview of the data.
Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Great, so we're going to move on to Brian. I'm going to pass presenter off to you.
Thank you. All right, let's.
Excellent.
Hopefully that's.
Got it. Perfect.
Is that showing up now?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. So thank you very much. That was a great setup. Both Rebecca and Steve leading into this, and I'll try and build on that. I'm with EPA and headquarters in the Office of Wetlands, Oceans, and Watersheds, working in the Clean Water Act Section 404 regulatory program, and I'm going to talk about a lot of different products that EPA and the Corps and other agencies and organizations here have gotten involved with and put out. And I'm going to start and lead into that with the evolution of how we got to where we are in terms of our focus on streams. Steve alluded to this already in terms of credit generation and bank approval that included banks with stream compensation credits. And really that kicked off right around the release of Regulatory Guidance Letter 2002-2. And that Regal was the first one to really specifically call out that, yes, stream mitigation should be considered and required by the Corps districts, and calling out the unique aspects by identifying the unique aspects of and challenges of stream mitigation, and identifying that streams are difficult to replace resources, and so typically you're going to focus on restoration, rehabilitation, enhancement, and in certain circumstances, preservation of streams as your compensation mechanism. Following on that was a lot of effort and series of workshops and guidance documents produced under the Mitigation Action Plan, which again continue to directly address the concerns of and the approach for stream compensation, although a lot of the projects and products produced from that were focused on wetland compensation. They also were calling out and integrating stream compensation considerations and concerns more directly. Flowing from the Mitigation Action Plan and statute directing the Corps to develop regulations, the 2008 Compensatory Mitigation Rule was developed and again specifically laid out a lot of and codified into regulations a lot of the guidance that had been developed and talked about and mulled over in the Mitigation Action Plan, and best practices learned from the experience across the country, and recommendations from National Research Council report from the early 2000s on the performance of compensatory mitigation, specifically looking at wetlands. But the 2008 mitigation rule identified streams and specific requirements, including as-built reports and mitigation work plan requirements that would be unique to streams in the regulations. It also spoke to that streams, again, are difficult to replace resources, and certain considerations about site design and discharge and how to address buffers and riparian area plantings. So again, as we move through the 2000s, you really see more and more stream compensation being brought to the forefront and onto the same plane as wetland compensation has been operating since much earlier in the 90s. Following on that, the 2012 nationwide permit package, and it was continued into the 2017 nationwide permit package, you started to see going back to the general permits used across the country for the vast majority of authorizations by the Corps for projects covered under the general permit program. you see specific thresholds then on the impact side being called out, not just in an acreage, but also in linear foot, and being called out by classification with flow duration, sometimes having different thresholds for what applies under the general permit for impacts to intermittent and ephemeral streams versus perennial streams. And we continue to see that in the 2017 nationwide permit package, looking at both area-based impacts for wetlands and linear foot-based thresholds for impacts for streams. Those thresholds can be, for many of the nationwide permits, can be waived with district engineer approval. But again, it's calling out the importance of evaluating streams and how they need to be evaluated in the unique context. So what have we been doing as agencies over time? Our focus over time in building with stream mitigation, well, beginning in the mid-2000s, EPA headquarters, for one, reached out to our regions and asked, what are the technical tools, training, what do you need to be able to do your job better? And we were also talking with Corps participants and others. And one of the main responses we heard from our field staff was they need help to review, evaluate, and understand stream assessment methods, stream mitigation proposals, the designs that they're getting in, and they need better tools to help them evaluate these as a regulator. There were, and there still are, in a growing number of trainings and tools out there for the practitioner to go out and learn how to design, evaluate a site, and then design a restoration proposal for streams. But often regulators don't have the time or the travel or training resources available to them to go out and learn the full scope of how to design a project, and we don't necessarily need to. We need to understand enough to be able to read and review designs. We need to know what the critical questions are, and we need to really know those assessment methods and work on those so that we can identify what's appropriate to apply in any particular situation and how to interpret those results. So that's what we've been focusing on. We've been focusing on identifying what assessment methods are out there, building on those, and helping each other and other agencies review and develop new assessment methods for use with streams. And sometimes those assessment methods are one and the same with methods to determine credits and debits for stream compensation projects. And sometimes those are separate, and the credits and debit tables and approaches are developed separately. We've also been, particularly more in recent years, thinking through and developing approaches and trying to standardize across regions and across agencies how we deal with non-traditional approaches to stream restoration and non-traditional applications of stream restoration. So that may be talking about things such as dam removal or water quality focused projects, as opposed to projects that were typically focused on habitat or geomorphology and stabilization of unstable and sediment producing reaches, and dealing with application of similar project types to other settings and to other purposes. So when folks are doing stream restoration like projects, but for the purposes of complying with TMDLs for nutrients, sediment, nitrogen, phosphorus, or sediment, or other things, and how do we evaluate those projects in the program. We've also begun to look into things such as how to deal with beaver coming into and during the design and review and monitoring period, and how to deal with long-term and think about the presence of beaver in the landscape and understanding what makes sense for long-term. That's more of an active area of discussion and work for us. Along with that, we've been looking at performance evaluation and how do we, and we'll talk on this more, both a little bit later in this presentation, and there'll be whole sections and future webinars based on this, but how do we know how well we're doing, and how do we evaluate mitigation site performance, both at the site level, at the approach, and how are these approaches working, and as a program overall, how do we evaluate the effectiveness of our compensatory mitigation requirements and program. As we've been focusing on these main elements, in general, we've been working through a process laid out in terms of developing compendiums and seeing what's the scope of materials and resources and expertise that currently exists in the literature, across practitioners, across other regulatory programs. In addition, looking at then what are the trainings we can either pull off the shelf or what trainings do we need to develop for our regulatory staff so that they have the tools needed to review these plans coming in that are being designed under different design approaches, that are being designed in different resource types and in different settings across the country. What are the tools that can help them do those reviews? What are the tools that will help them either develop, or what are the assessment methods they can use off the kind of off the shelf or with modifications? And then really focusing on implementation. How do we take this knowledge? How do we take these trainings and tools and help specific areas of the country when they're ready, when they're thirsting for this opportunity to update their SOPs, to develop new SOPs or assessment methods or programs? How do we support them in doing that, and what's regionally appropriate? So the next few slides, I'm going to highlight some of the examples. On the last slide of the presentation, you'll see the link to EPA's website where you can find either the documents, all of these documents themselves, or links to them on other people's sites, such as ELI's site, the host of this webinar series. So in the terms of developing compendiums and assessing the range of what's out there related to streams, we did compendiums both in 2004 and 2010. We did 2 of them because there was an amazing growth across the country. In 2004, things were just getting started. There were practitioners and stream mitigation and stream compensation being done in some parts of the country. And we were looking at a lot of tools, some being used in the regulatory context, some not, and pulled those together to help inform folks. By 2010, it was worth it to invest again and see how much had bloomed and how much many more resources were available from across the country, and make sure we got a handle on that going forward. Those really helped inform us, working with the Fish and Wildlife Service and stream mechanics to develop a function-based framework for stream assessment and restoration projects. And this really laid out a thought process and provided a communication tool, the functional lift pyramid, that we found very useful as a framework to review projects and to ensure that as we're reviewing assessment methods, as we're reviewing different proposals, we're capturing all the different elements of stream processes and function, and we can communicate those clearly with each other, with both within EPA and as a communication tool to communicate with other agencies and applicants. We've also helped support ASWM, develop a report on state definitions, jurisdiction, and mitigation requirements in state programs. And really, you'll hear a lot more about that in the next presentation, so I won't say more on that. And you've already heard some, and you'll hear more throughout this webinar series about the stream mitigation document produced by ELI, and the focus of this series, and really led to kicking off this webinar series itself. In terms of trainings, we have developed the function-based framework training as kind of our baseline stream function and review class. We developed it internally for EPA first, and then it's been pushed out and it's offered through Fish and Wildlife Service National Conservation Training Center. It's offered directly by stream mechanics and others. or stream mechanics as well, as a training to help get folks communicating using the same terms and on the same base level of understanding of stream functions and processes and assessment methods and tools that are out there right now. That's a training that we found useful for, especially for IRTs and other groups that are just stepping into the stream assessment and world and updating SOPs that have been around a long time, and many of the developers maybe aren't there anymore, and so you've got a lot of new staff as a great way to get folks at least to a base understanding of stream functional process and the tools that are out there. We did a specific application for stream mitigation in terms of surface coal mining and coal mining activities in Appalachia, and did a whole workshop and put those materials online as well, with a focus both in terms of the different agencies involved and the application to the Appalachian mountain context, and dealing with the unique issues of a landscape both being actively mined as well as with a long history of mining. Annually, we have been supporting with the Corps and Fish and Wildlife Service, the Conservation Fund, and doing interagency review team trainings. And all those materials are available on the Conservation Fund's website, and those trainings have been really to help more on the regulations themselves, the 2008 mitigation rule and the existing guidance documents since the training before the 2008 mitigation rule, but also bringing in some of those technical aspects and introducing our regulators across EPA, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, and our state and federal agency partners on what tools are out there, introducing them to what's being done across the country and what they may want to look at as resources as they dig into developing different SOPs or updating theirs. There's also a plethora of materials out there and webinars. ASWM has done several webinar series that have great resources in terms of stream mitigation experience and examples and case studies being presented. Fish and Wildlife Service also has a stream series as well that you can, both of those are banked and you can watch the old videos recordings. And we hope that this series itself from ELI will add to that canon of knowledge that folks can access at their leisure to learn more about stream compensation practices and what others have been done and learn from it. We've also supported in-lieu fee trainings and other regulatory-based trainings to make sure that practitioners and our collaborators across the federal and state agencies are up to speed on the regulations and are exposed to the experiences and practices across the country. In terms of tools, in the very beginning, in the mid-2000s, early 2000s, most of the stream restoration and compensation proposals were coming in with a Rosgan-based design or a natural channel design, and our folks really needed to understand that and what were the key questions to ask. And so we partnered again with Fish and Wildlife Service and Stream Mechanics to develop a natural channel design review checklist for folks and put that out. Our function-based framework document also helps guide folks through different opportunities and different options for reviewing projects and how to translate what they're looking at in terms of goals and objectives to what they should be monitoring, to performance standards for their projects. There's also been a number of projects that are not necessarily stream alone focused, but have been focused on developing and improving practices and supporting other entities that play an important role in compensatory mitigation programs, such as a handbook for land trusts developed by ELI and the Land Trust Alliance that really helps them understand what they're getting involved with as they come on or as they consider becoming long-term stewards for compensatory mitigation projects. As was mentioned earlier, the watershed approach is a never-ending opportunity for us to improve how we site and where we choose to put projects on the landscape, and how we review projects and prioritize our actions. And so handbook developed there by ELI, as well as the handbook developed by ELI and TNC, as well as a handbook for prioritizing stream and wetland restoration and protection using landscape analysis tools. Another tool that is useful to the agencies, and perhaps even more useful to those folks looking into becoming long-term stewards, is that long-term stewardship calculator and accompanying handbook developed by the Nature Conservancy as well. Now, looking at implementation, the Corps, working with EPA, developed a mitigation rule retrospective, which is looking at the first 5 years. It came out in 2015, but it really focuses on the first 5 years of implementation of the 2008 mitigation rule, and looks at overall trends and numbers and what's been occurring. And it really highlights the growth in stream mitigation practices even post-rule issuance. The Corps has also worked with, and EPA helped with review of Compensatory Mitigation Site Protection Instrument Handbook and Financial Assurances Handbook, both important topics for stream restoration projects as well as wetland restoration projects. Hot off the presses, we also have natural resource damages, mitigation banking and the watershed approach document from the Environmental Law Institute. Just came out in March, I believe, of 2018, which not specifically focused on stream compensation, but helps bridge the 404 compensatory mitigation markets with the natural resource damage assessment market for responses to things like oil spills, and shows where there are opportunities and what kind of spill responses may produce the best opportunities for using the already reviewed and approved projects under the 404 program as mitigation banks that exist on the landscape. I'm going to jump over here and actually pull up now and show, just flash up the websites for the Corps of Engineers Portland district here. And this is highlighting, again, hot off the presses, just a couple of weeks ago, the joint public notice for the stream functional assessment method for Oregon. This was a joint project developed with under EPA leadership from our Region 10 office in Tracy Nadeau, with the Oregon Department of State Lands, their aquatic resources mitigation framework, and partners also at the Portland district of the Corps of Engineers. And so this is really setting up a stream functional assessment method and mitigation process in Oregon that should help allow the growth of stream mitigation banking, as well as standardize and make more clear for permittees as well as mitigation providers just what's going to be required and how predictable it will be for stream mitigation projects in Oregon. And the tools, if you're interested in looking at them, the user manual workbook and the scientific support document, the scientific rationale for all the decisions that were made in development of this method is really an outstanding work product that really opens up the hood and shows what the data is behind each of the decisions made, and explains it so that you can fully understand how this method was developed and what's there. I'll also point to the Savannah District Corps of Engineers public notice from just a few months prior, releasing their updated SOP that updates not just for stream mitigation, but for wetland mitigation as well. And it lays out their new approaches for compensatory mitigation. And these are two examples of how we've taken, taken us from compendiums to trainings and tools development, and now we're helping to try and support IRTs and other groups to develop the tools and really turn them into on-the-ground implementation of these. You're also seeing stream in Georgia. The Savannah district is taking an approach of the stream quantification tool. That's also been done in Wyoming. It's been done by the state in North Carolina, and it's being explored under the leadership of the state in Tennessee in partnership with the IRT members, as well as other places across the country. So there are different approaches to developing these. In Oregon, it's a full development from classification system through assessment method to a Oregon specific tool that'll be very useful and I think informative for other parts of the country as well. In these other states, Georgia, Wyoming, they've taken a tool off the shelf that we helped develop over the years and inform the development of, and now are implementing it and making it specific to their areas and taking different approaches to doing that. Moving forward, you'll see from EPA and I think and our partner agencies as well, continued focus on the tools and trainings and resources for our regulatory staff. We're seeing staff turnover across the agency and movement around agencies and across the program across agencies. So it's always important to make sure we have these trainings available and we're continuing to develop the tools and resources they need to come up to speed on the program, to come up to speed on the scientific principles and resources they're working with, and then be able to effectively lead and implement the programs. We're going to continue to support implementation at the local level and see that these help make the regulatory program clearer and more predictable by putting out tools and resources and SOPs and assessment methods that anyone can then, with the proper education or training, take out and use and be able to predict and have a clear knowledge of what their compensation requirements may be and what their compensation production may be from any given site. We're also looking at information sharing and improved data management to help understand and make sure that we are learning from our experiences. We're building on what we've done and getting better as we go along, and that we are taking full advantage of the improved information technology that's out there and the opportunities that are out there to synthesize data faster, clearer, and make sure that all of the massive amounts of data that come in and are developed associated with mitigation projects are being turned into useful information for the agencies to make decisions and useful information across projects to make decisions about the program going forward. Speaking of the program going forward, EPA is working on, and you should see coming out later in 2018, and there will be webinars focused on this later in this webinar series, focused on the long-term approach to compensatory mitigation program evaluation. So looking at the performance of the ecological success of compensation sites, as well as compliance with regulatory requirements, looking at effectiveness and the effectiveness of compensation programs at offsetting aquatic resource losses and contributing to those no net loss goals. So how effective are we as a program at meeting those goals or contributing to those goals? And also laying out approaches for looking at resiliency and the long-term resiliency and sustainability of compensation sites on the landscape and in comparison to natural stream and wetland complexes on the landscape. So this long-term approach document is going to lay out the framework and recommendations for how that can be done effectively and how that can be done in a way at the state or local level that allows this information to be rolled up and compared and looked at at larger regional or national levels when multiple studies are conducted. And this is really stemming from evaluations done several years ago by Joe Morgan and Palmer Huff, looking at the scope of compensatory mitigation of studies that have been done since the NRC report in the early 2000s. And really what they saw was a drop-off over time in compensatory mitigation evaluations, and really very, very few focused on stream compensation. And so we're working now to lay out clear processes for folks to do that, identify how it can be done with this technical document, and then also you'll see following that in the future, we're looking to put some pilot projects on the ground and show, working with specific states, and be able to show, hey, not just here's the framework for how to do it, here's how a couple of states have done it, and what benefits they've gotten from that. So there are more things to come. In addition to that, we continue to be very interested in effective performance standards and looking at what's been done and mining the information that for projects that are on the ground that have been implemented, and looking across and seeing what are the commonalities in performance standards, which ones seem to be working really well, which ones perhaps aren't as effective, and where we can identify best practices going forward. So all of those documents mentioned on the prior slide, you can either access directly or are linked to from the website there, and as well as my contact information. And I'm more than happy to answer questions or get feedback as we have time today or in the future as ideas or thoughts come to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brian. That was a great overview and a lot of good teasers for what's to come, including on our next webinar, we will have Tracy talk about the Oregon assessment methodology. So it was a good way to introduce that, and we'll go into much more depth on that in August. And I have one question for you about that Oregon functional assessment tool, and then I'll ask it and then I'll switch over to Brenda. Oregon's new function assessment tool seems fundamentally different from the others that have been developed. Can you explain or characterize what is different and whether this represents an advancement relative to others?
I'm going to defer a lot of that to Tracy and come to that August 27th webinar. What is different in terms of the approach is that it was actually gone out and developed from assessment information. And so they developed a conceptual framework. They developed a classification for streams in Oregon that made the most sense for that framework. They went out and collected data, and then using that data informed what metrics they're using and informed which metrics are most valuable, and they're weighting between them. It was also developed not just for 404, but the Department of State Lands in Oregon is a co-regulator with the Corps and EPA and the 404 program, and so they have similar but unique requirements under their regulations as well. So it's one of those places where it really made sense to start from the ground up and develop a method that would be fully meeting the needs of both the state and the federal regulatory programs. The difference with a lot of the other, so it doesn't have a credit debit multiplier table like what you saw the example Rebecca put up from Missouri, and you'll see in a lot of SOPs from across the country. And it's also not built on the stream quantification tool framework from the functional lift pyramid, like what's been done in Wyoming and is being and Georgia and North Carolina and is being worked on others in other areas. Those pull from existing data sets and understanding and knowledge, and then are regionalized to what information and data is available for those states specifically. And Oregon was started from the ground up, just focused on Oregon.
Excellent. I'm going to move on to Brenda and Jean now. Thank you so much, Brian, and hopefully we'll have time for a few more questions at the end. All right, thanks.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. My name is Brenda Zolich, and I'm here with Jean Christie. Jean is the Executive Director of the Association of State Wetland Managers, and I'm a policy analyst here. And one of the things that I was able to do recently in the last couple of years was to look at stream issues. And so we're going to talk today about a report that that Brian has already mentioned that EPA helped fund through a wetland program development grant, talk about state mitigation requirements in state programs for streams in the United States. We want to make very clear here that we're presenting some data that is very time oriented. So in 2014, we published this report. It was a snapshot in time, but some of the information that we have in this report has not been updated by anyone else since then. So we were asked to make a presentation. The study didn't just look at mitigation. It was designed to increase understanding about the status and diversity of stream identification, delineation, and mitigation practices in the U.S. And again, we appreciate that EPA gave us a wetland program development grant to do this work, and we're pleased to see it as part of the suite of supports that they recognize for the work they're doing on stream mitigation. And our work in this report was focused on Section 404 and 401 water quality certification program activities. Rebecca gave a nice little overview of her methodology. I'm just going to say that we got 47 out of 50 states to participate. We had representation from all 10 EPA regions. The only states that are not included in the report are Alaska, Mississippi, and Louisiana. We used semi-structured interviews, did a comparative analysis, and included in the report, which is a chunky report, has some comparative tables and matrices comparing all 47 states in 18 different areas. So the report has summaries for each of the questions, but then it has very detailed matrices and tables in the back that may be useful to folks. But again, the data collection date is 2014, and so the information is somewhat dated. So I wanted to talk to you about a couple of key elements that we pulled out of the report. There are many, many more things that we discussed, but in 2014, ASWM study found state stream work at a pivotal time in the US. The widespread practice of stream mitigation was much newer than wetland mitigation, some of which had already been in place since the 1990s. Most stream mitigation had been initiated since the EPA and the Corps issued final regulations governing compensatory mitigation for authorized impacts to streams and other waters under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act in 2008. At the time of the report, in most states, either the state or the Corps had some form of stream mitigation process in place or was currently developing stream mitigation programs or practices. For example, in 2014, again, somewhat dated, Arizona, Minnesota, Montana, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Wyoming had stream mitigation programs in the early stages of development. So it's very much something that everybody was working on in those areas. And also the amount of stream mitigation happening in each state varied widely, regardless of whether it was implemented by the state or the Corps. So the amount of stream mitigation, we originally were trying to quantify this, and that was proved a pretty impossible task. But we did come up with a very, very qualitative assessment of whether it was a mixed bag of mitigation, meaning that they had some large projects, but mostly small. So 16 states had that. 11 states had really a large amount of mitigation of streams. 7 had a small amount. And then 11 states had none or almost none. And that's very important for us as we create a benchmark study here in 2014 to see whether those states that had none or almost none have moved into that new realm of doing things. So ASWM study also revealed some insights about what influenced the use of requirements for stream mitigation in states. These included limited access to resources. Many people said they wanted to do it, they just couldn't. They didn't have the structure, they didn't have the staff, they didn't have the money. Increasing high water events and greater stormwater runoff was something that was stimulating people to start thinking more about stream mitigation. The economic impact on a number of applications. This went either way, that when the economy was doing very well, lots of development was happening and streams were being impacted. So, but on the other hand, during the recession, economic impact has definitely reduced the number of applications that they had and the amount of mitigation that needed to take place. And when we were talking to people and it had declined, they said that they were very much concerned about being in the place to have the capacity to do more mitigation when the economy started turning around. So it'd be very interesting to see now. And obviously the slides that Steve put up there shows that the trend has definitely continued to increase. Also, various types of mining has had an influence, and the expanding U.S. energy industry. ASWM is doing another project right now about pipeline development, and surely we are seeing expanding, especially natural gas. So the next thing we wanted to share was about programs and practices. Again, remember, this is somewhat dated. Having any formalized stream mitigation was certainly not a given for states in 2014. 15 states reported having their own formal state coordinated stream mitigation program, with an additional 6 states reporting state mitigation practices, but no formal program. So there's a difference here. Having a full program where everything is structured and you have staff and all that. Practices meaning that they might have some guidance documents or even informal guidance documents. So 5 states operated as part of an interagency stream mitigation program arrangement, so they didn't necessarily run it themselves, while 19 states left mitigation to the Corps or had no stream mitigation at all in their states. So we were really interested in what states were doing, so we lumped those two together as a whole. Mitigation was not formally predicated on matching up stream types or stream uses. I know that there was mention in an earlier presentation where they were talking about what they were looking for when mitigation was being done for an impact. Although in 33 states, the entity implementing stream mitigation in the state did differentiate between types and uses of streams when they determined mitigation requirements. Only 13 of these states had formalized this mitigation requirement. So we were really looking at not just what was happening on the ground, but was there the important task of making those things into formalized documents. Most of this in-kind matching process was informal. As I mentioned, 20 states were informal, relying on best professional judgment for decision making. As I wrote this report, the word BPJ was the phrase, the acronym of the day, because almost all activities and decisions were case by case and best professional judgment. And then consideration of specific types of differences were reported by 51% of the state, or 24 states, with these differences most commonly based on stream type, location, water quality or classification, and stream condition, quality, and habitat type. We also wanted to share with you about stream mitigation options. So stream mitigation was then and continues to be a relatively new form of mitigation across the country, as I've mentioned. Consequently, it's not surprising that in 2014, there continued to be more mitigation options for wetlands than streams in a number of states. For streams, however, the most common mitigation option reported was permittee responsible mitigation, which we're not sure that that would be true now, which was reported in 39 states, with mitigation banks the next most common option offered in 25 states, and the least common being in lieu fee programs offered in 22 states. So we think that information is pretty dated, so certainly don't use our report as your end-all be-all of information. We wanted to also let you know about allowable stream mitigation activities. While the report offered many other insights, the last I will share with you today, because we wanted to just give you a snapshot, maybe a little taste, so you check it out, we're going to share with you about what we found to be allowable stream mitigation activities. What was shared by states as allowable also varied across the country. 20 states considered all proposed options for stream mitigation, meaning that if an applicant proposed it, they would consider it. However, 29 states did provide a little more direction to applicants, sharing that they had identified specific activities that qualified as stream mitigation in their state. So they didn't dictate those things, but they identified what could be considered. And again, 6 states shared that they did not require mitigation at all. As we've already heard from many of the other stream mitigation related decisions, the majority of states made decisions about what activities were allowable on a site by case-by-case basis using best professional judgment. When asked what activities they allowed, we found that most states commonly were seeing stream restoration, stream stabilization, buffer or riparian work, and stream enhancement, with stream preservation and hydraulic modifications following closely behind. And I would completely agree with what Steve found in 2014. We found only one state that was dabbling in the idea of stream creation, which you're talking about here in your slide, Steve, as establishment. We found that most states said that that's just not something they can do. You cannot establish a stream. So our findings definitely concur with that. And other allowable stream mitigation activities included stream reestablishment, work to increase sinuosity, daylighting of streams, and redirecting stream flow. And before I hand it over to Jean, I just wanted to give you an idea of some of the key takeaways. We really, when we did this project, wanted to create a baseline of information about what states are doing, how they're thinking about streams, how they're identifying them, what's in, what's out. Obviously, this is important right now in our political environment where we're looking at what's in and out for waters of the United States. But we specifically were interested also in stream mitigation. And we found it very much to be a new thing. We're very pleased to see the more recent information that was presented today, seeing that it's continuing on to grow and have lots more formalization. There's a diversity of state statutes and regulations. That's something that if you want to visit our report on aswm.org, there's all sorts of detailed information about what they have for information to support these. Certainly, there's no one size fits all among the states. The stream mitigation and wetland work, all of that is very different between states with lots of different caveats and contextual information. Wetland mitigation we found is nothing like stream mitigation. There are some common elements, but stream mitigation is definitely its own thing. And there was a need for sharing of models and templates. And we really appreciate seeing what Brian was presenting and the fact that he's trying to see on the ground changes and examples and document those, because that was definitely one of the takeaways from the project. And that all resources, when taken from one state, would need to be adapted to another. So I'm going to hand things over to Jean Christie here, who's going to talk about some more details about stream mitigation. And I know that Rebecca is going to take over the presenter role and pull up Jean's slide.
So thanks, everybody. You'll be delighted to know my presentation is exactly one slide long. So after following 3 really great presentations, I have only a little bit to add here. And you'll see the report I'm talking about is wetland restoration, contemporary issues and lessons learned. Over the last 4 years, through a couple of wetland program development grants, we at the Association of State Wetland Managers have taken a look at why we were hearing anecdotally wetland restoration fails. And in the course of having those discussions, we talked about streams as well and stream restoration, although not as much. We think that some of our major takeaways are very relevant to the ecological performance, the ecological side of how to get something worthwhile out of stream mitigation. There are significant differences. Water flows through streams. Wetlands tend to be, I'm not sure static is really a good word, but the water tends to stay there for a long time. So you don't have high energy environments. It's impacted by the watershed, but upstream impacts and downstream impacts as well can have a profound effect on whatever is done to the stream at the mitigation site. That's something that's not dealt with in wetlands and is a continuing source of challenge, except in those places where they manage to, I guess, acquire the entire stream upstream, and then it works. So site selection and a plan that's appropriate to the site selection. If I were going to say that there's one really, really big problem in compensatory mitigation, it's selecting a site and matching it up with a plan that's appropriate to that site. That includes what it used to be, as well as how the watershed has altered around it. So good site selection, and the challenge of altered and altering watersheds is a significant one. We've drained 100 million acres of wetlands. We have straightened probably millions upon millions of miles of streams over the last 200 plus years in North America, and particularly in the United States. And streams are not like they used to be, nor is the rest of the aquatic resource. So what's a good decision? What do you restore to? And what's your benchmark, or what is the performance you can reasonably achieve? I think everybody is struggling with that. Also, the sort of artificial separation of wetlands and streams in compensatory mitigation, into the study of these systems and everything else. As we have talked to people that have been doing a lot of compensatory mitigation or stream restoration, they'll say, wow, we did that stream restoration and we got 6 acres of wetlands in the floodplain that they didn't plan for. Well, of course, when floodplains and streams were in contact with each other, when you didn't have the incised streams that are characteristic of so much of the country, the water was closer to the surface of floodplains and you had a lot of wetlands there. So I am hoping, as we move ahead and learn more about stream mitigation and stream restoration, that it will just be logical to think about how to restore these together in all sorts of different kinds of projects, including compensatory mitigation. And then for many years, folks have struggled with how to evaluate ecological lift, and many times in the compensatory mitigation framework, that translates into, how many credits is something worth. And years ago, when we did a much earlier project, for example, people were saying, well, if they do more, they use more heavy equipment or something like that, we're giving them more points, but sometimes if they do less, we get better results. So I think that it's been a challenge for the stream restoration community in general. My conversations with them over the years have indicated they think they're about 10 or 20 years behind the people that are trying to figure out how to do wetland restoration, and we have much left to learn there. So, it was demonstrated, and I think particularly in Brian's presentation, that there are an increasing number of tools available to try to get at these and a myriad other issues. And I also expect that they will be continuing to challenge us for many years. I think in general, as a statement looking beyond compensatory mitigation, one of the largest challenges for water quality, addressing floods, providing high quality compensatory mitigation, is how to get streams back and connected to their floodplains. And I think any of you on the webinar that are out in the field looking and trying to figure out what to do are well aware that that is not a small challenge, particularly in parts of the country where we see big in size streams 15, 20 feet below the floodplain. It's a big challenge. And I think the world of compensatory mitigation provides an opportunity to try to figure out some of those solutions, because there's a significant financial incentive to solving this problem in the context of stream compensatory mitigation. And with that, I will wrap up.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jean and Brenda. I really appreciate that overview of your work, and again, setting up some of the future webinars that we'll be seeing later on in this series. So I appreciate that. I know we're at the end of our time, and there's some people still on, so I might just sneak in a few last questions if anyone has any for Jean and Brenda. I do have one on resources available for states to review stream loss for permitting, and the question was, is ORM's reporting data available to states? And I'm not sure I know the answer, and I'm sorry we lost Steve, but I don't know, Brian, if you know how states would be able to get their hands on any of that data, or Jean and Brenda, if you have thoughts.
So Ribbit's data is available, and folks can look at the, banker in lieu fees that have been approved and the credits available. That's all available on Ribbit's publicly. ORM data is not as easy to get at. It is public data, but generally Freedom of Information Act requests are how folks access ORM records. There is a limited amount of ORM information that's available through the Corps' website. Their headquarters website has lists of issued permits, lists of pending individual permits, and where jurisdictional determinations have been made, approved jurisdictional determinations have been made, but they are not, none of those things include the level of detail of, the size of the aquatic resource being impacted, or the compensation, or how compensation is being provided.
Okay, thanks. I hope that helps, Kim. And then I'm going to sneak in one more question, because I think it's interesting and something that we've thought a little bit about, but the question is about preservation. And the question goes, some states seem to encourage protection of high quality streams, while other districts give very little or no credit for protection or preservation. And I think that Ruth Ladd from the New England Corps District was on. I think she's not on anymore. And she may be able to speak to that a little bit, but I don't know if that's something, Brenda and Jean, you encountered in your work, or Brian, if you had some thoughts on if there's any consistency and rationale across the country on preservation.
Well, this is Jean, and we don't have a comprehensive answer to that. I do know that some states are more intact than others with respect to the resources they have and the opportunities for any kind of restoration, whether it's wetlands or streams. We struggle with that up here in Maine and New Hampshire and New England, because while there have been significant losses, they're a lot less than some of the other parts of the country. But Brian, I can weigh in on this. This has been something that folks have wrestled with in the wetlands context for a long time. Is preservation an appropriate tool or not? It does lead to a net loss, but it also secures protection of resources that may be at risk otherwise.
And our report in 2014 had that 19 states allowed stream preservation as part of their compensatory mitigation, which was 66% of the 47.
And that may not, that could go up or down.
Totally, yeah. We don't know. But
I think wetland preservation was much more acceptable early on, and then started to be not as well received, and now seems to be better received than a few years ago.
Yeah, I think what I'd want to point out in terms of stream preservation is that in those cases we're talking about preserving the riparian corridor associated with these projects, in my understanding, and so it's not that it's just the footprint of the stream that's being preserved. It's the riparian corridor that buffers along with it.
That's a good point. Thanks. Well, I think with that, since we're already a bit late, we'll wrap up, and thank you to the panelists and presenters today. We really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us today. Again, look for additional invitations for the upcoming webinars. Our next one is August 27th. You should see something in your inbox in the next week or so. It's going to be a really interesting panel again on assessing functions and conditions for streams, and we have 3 great panelists. Looking forward to that. So thank you again to everyone, and look forward to seeing you in the next webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you.